Nobody warned Lieutenant Duravas that the most important diplomatic moment in human history would happen inside a soap bubble. She didn't plan it, she didn't prepare a speech, she didn't consult a committee, or run it through 12 layers of translation protocol. She just reached into her pocket, pulled out a small plastic wand her niece had tucked in there as a joke, and blew, and a single shimmering bubble floated up through the recycled air of the Velfari throne hall, and a crying alien princess stopped crying. What happened next changed everything, not just between humans and the Velfari Empire, between two species who had spent 6 years circling each other with their hands hovering over weapons they both desperately did not want to use. 6 years before that bubble, humanity had no idea the Velfari existed. We were still arguing about whether the faint radio signal from the Kepler belt was natural background noise or something deliberate. We were still months away from answering that question when a ship appeared in high orbit above Earth, not approaching, not broadcasting, not threatening, just there, waiting. The Velfari did not announce themselves. They did not send a greeting. They parked a vessel the size of a small continent in geostationary orbit, and they waited and they watched and they said nothing for 11 days. It was the most terrifying silence in recorded human history. Every government on Earth scrambled. Military assets repositioned. Panic buying cleared shelves in 17 countries. Within 48 hours, a dozen fringe groups declared it was the end. 3 others declared it was salvation. Everyone was wrong about what it actually was. It was a test. The Velfari, it turned out, had made contact with 4 other species before humanity. 3 of those species had responded to unexplained orbital presence with immediate hostile action. 1 had launched nuclear weapons within 6 hours. The Velfari had learned across centuries of exploration that the first response a civilization shows in that moment of impossible uncertainty tells you almost everything you need to know about whether they are worth speaking to at all. Humanity argued. Humanity panicked. Humanity did absolutely nothing aggressive for 11 days, not because we were wise, but because we couldn't agree on what to do. And somehow that stumbling, fractious, deeply human paralysis looked from orbit like restraint. On day 12 they sent a probe down unmanned. It landed in a field in northern Kazakhstan and opened like a flower, and inside it was a message encoded in mathematics, basic, beautiful, patient mathematics that said in effect, we see you, we are ready to speak if you are. The next 3 years were the most complicated diplomatic negotiations in human history, and most of it happened between translators and linguists and xenobiologists who were learning an alien language in real time. Progress was slow. There were misunderstandings. There were moments when everything nearly fell apart over something as simple as the wrong inflection on a greeting. Because to the Velfari, tone was not decoration, tone was meaning. Tone was law. But eventually, humanity and the Velfari reached something fragile and remarkable, an agreement to meet in person, face to face. A human delegation would travel to the Velfari home system aboard a Velfari vessel, and they would be received in the throne hall of the cascading voice, which was the seat of power for the Velfari Queen Prime. Lieutenant Duravas was not supposed to be the one who mattered. She was security detail. She was there to stand in the back and look capable and not touch anything. The actual diplomatic heavy lifting was supposed to be handled by Ambassador Kenji Halst, who had spent 4 years learning to speak passable Velthari and who had a voice made for calm, measured declarations. Dara's job was to watch the doors, but fate, it turns out, has a very particular sense of humor. Here's what nobody tells you about alien diplomacy, the thing that all the briefing documents and cultural sensitivity training can't actually prepare you for. It's not the strain, gravity, it's not the architecture that seems designed to make you feel insignificant. It's not even the eyes. It's the children, because the Velthari Queen Prime had a daughter. Her name, phonetically translated, was something close to Velharissa, which meant roughly she who inherits the cascade. She was, by Velthari standards, very young, equivalent to perhaps 8 or 9 human years, and she had been brought to the throne hall to observe the historic meeting, seated on a smaller throne to the left of her mother, dressed in ceremonial armor that was 3 sizes too big for her small frame. She looked, in spite of everything, in spite of the bioluminescent markings on her skin, the 4-fingered hands, the large opalescent eyes that reflected light like a deep-sea fish. She looked exactly like a child who did not want to be there. She looked bored. She looked uncomfortable. She looked like a kid at a grown-up dinner party who had been told to sit still and be good and was slowly dying inside. Dara noticed her immediately. The throne hall of the cascading voice was extraordinary. That is almost not worth saying. Everything about Velthari architecture was extraordinary. They built in curves and spirals, never in right angles, and their halls tended to open upward into vast vaulted spaces, filled with what appeared to be living, light, bioluminescent organisms embedded in the ceiling that pulsed slowly in patterns that the xenobiologists back home were still trying to figure out. The whole space breathed. The delegation entered in formal order. Ambassador Halst in front, flanked by his 2 senior advisors, behind them 2 xenobiologists who were there to observe and document everything, and at the rear, doing exactly what security detail does, were Dara and her partner, Specialist Tobias Crane. The Queen Prime was already seated when they entered. Her name was something that no human had yet managed to pronounce correctly. The official transliteration was something like Velkashari, and she was, without question, the most physically imposing figure Dara had ever stood in a room with. 7 ft tall, perfectly still, draped in layered fabric that moved as though it existed in slightly different gravity than everything else. Her bioluminescent markings were complex and elaborate, running in spirals from her temples down her neck, patterns that apparently conveyed rank, lineage, and personal history all at once. She watched the human delegation enter with eyes that gave nothing away. The ceremony began. There were formalized greetings, and Halst delivered them in careful Velthari, his pronunciation nearly perfect. And there was a beat, a genuine moment where the Queen Prime's head tilted slightly, which the linguist had told them was the Velthari equivalent of a raised eyebrow of approval. Things were going well. Dara stood at the back and watched the room, and she kept coming back to the small throne on the left. Velthari saw the princess had started out doing what she'd presumably been told to do. She was sitting straight. She was watching the proceedings, her hands were folded, her lap in what was probably the Veltharia equivalent of polite, formal posture. But she was clearly miserable. Her bioluminescent markings had gone from whatever their resting brightness was to something dimmer, more muted. And one of the briefings had mentioned, almost in passing, that Veltharia emotional states often express themselves through changes in bioluminescent intensity. Bright meant engaged, excited, alert. Dim meant withdrawn, sad, or frightened. The princess was dimming slowly over about 40 minutes of carefully choreographed diplomatic ceremony. The light in her skin was fading. And GT, and then very quietly she started to cry. It was not dramatic. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. The tears were a pale, almost silver color, another detail from the xenobiology briefings that Dara was now extremely grateful for, because without that context she might have assumed it was some kind of medical emergency. But it wasn't. She was just a small, overwhelmed child sitting in a throne too big for and GT, her in armor that didn't fit, watching adults do adult things for hours, and she had reached the end of her ability to pretend it was fine. Nobody else in the delegation noticed. Their eyes were all forward on the ceremony, on the Queen Prime, on the careful choreography of the moment. Dara noticed, and the Queen Prime noticed that Dara noticed. For one long still second, the two of them made eye contact, the 7FT alien empress and the human woman standing in the back, and something passed between them that was not language and not protocol and not anything that had been covered in any briefing. It was the silent, shared recognition between two people who both see the same small, sad child and are both wondering what to do about it. Dara looked away, back to the ceremony. Her hand went into her pocket, a nervous habit, something to ground herself, and her fingers closed around the small plastic bubble wand. Her niece Macy had shoved it in there 2 days before departure, laughing, saying it was for good luck, and Dara had forgotten it was there until this exact moment. She stood very still for about 10 seconds, weighing approximately 17 different considerations simultaneously, including, but not limited to, diplomatic protocol, military conduct standards, the possibility that this would end her career, the possibility that this would end the diplomatic mission, and the knowledge that this small alien child was crying silver tears and had been crying them quietly and alone for several minutes now. She uncapped the wand. She blew one bubble, perfect, round, iridescent, catching the bioluminescent light of the throne hall and throwing back colors that soap bubbles don't usually show. Deep violet, electric blue, a brief flash of gold. It floated up from her lips and drifted lazily on some imperceptible current of recycled air toward the small throne on the left. The princess stopped crying, her eyes large and opalescent and currently very red at the edges, tracked the bubble. It drifted toward her. It caught the light. Again, her bioluminescent markings flickered just once, just briefly. Something in her brightened. The bubble reached her, hovered for a moment directly in front of her face, and popped. The princess blinked, looked at where the bubble had been, looked at Dara. Her markings flickered again, brighter this time. Dara very carefully, very quietly, blew another one. The princess forgot she was sad. What happened next should not have worked by every rule of the protocol. briefings by every cultural sensitivity, training module by every careful, diplomatic calculus that had brought them to this moment. What Dara did next should have been a disaster. She walked across the throne hall slowly, not rushing, not asking permission, just moving with the calm, deliberate confidence of someone who has decided that a small child crying alone is more important than standing in the correct spot. She walked to the princess's throne. She knelt down. She held out the bubble wand. The princess looked at it, looked at Dara. Her markings flickered in complex patterns that no human could read yet but the xenobiologists watching the recording later would note something remarkable. The pattern was almost identical to the one Velthari children show in response to being offered a gift: curiosity, delight, uncertainty about whether it was really for them. Dara mimed blowing, held the wand out. The princess took it, blew too hard, got a face full of soap residue, and no bubble, blinked in surprise, looked at Dara. Dara stated again, softer, slow breath. The princess tried again. This time a small cluster of bubbles exploded outward, and the princess's entire body lit up literally. Her bioluminescent markings flared to full brightness all at once. This sudden blaze of light and color that filled the immediate space around her, and she made a sound that the translation protocols had no category for, but that every human being in the room recognized instantly. NGT, laughter. NGT, she laughed. An alien child laughed for the first time in the presence of a human being, and the sound was strange and beautiful, and it echoed in the vaulted space of the throne hall of the cascading voice, and the Queen Prime, for the first time in the entire ceremony, moved. She turned her head, not toward the ambassador, not toward the diplomatic proceedings that had been so carefully prepared. She turned her head and she looked at her daughter, who was glowing, who was laughing, who was chasing bubbles off the edge of her too big throne, and she went very still, and then slowly her own bioluminescent markings began to change. They brightened. Fallen Crandor. Act 3. The Queen watches in silence. 11:00–17:30. The ceremony had technically paused. Ambassador Host had noticed what was happening, turned slightly, and was experiencing what could diplomatically be described as a minor internal crisis. The xenobiologists were recording everything. Tobias Crane, Dara's partner, had quietly moved to stand slightly closer to the exit, which was just good security habit when things went unpredictably. But nobody intervened because nobody was sure what intervention would even mean. The Queen Prime had gone utterly still. Not the stillness of someone about to act, the stillness of someone watching something they did not expect and choosing deliberately not to interrupt it. Dara was completely focused on the princess. She'd pulled out her phone. She carried it mostly for the camera, a habit, and found a bubble-related video, a demonstration of different techniques. Large bubbles, small bubbles, chains of bubble. She held it up so the princess could see the screen. The princess stared at it with an expression of pure, unguarded wonder. They stayed like that for 11 minutes. Afterward, when Dara was asked what she was thinking during those 11 minutes, she said she wasn't thinking anything particularly profound. She was just making sure the kid could see the screen. She was watching the bubbles the same way the kid was watching them. She'd forgotten somewhere in there that she was in the most important diplomatic venue in human history. She was just sitting on the floor of a strange room with a strange child, watching Bubbles. The Queen Prime watched them both the entire time. When Vilharis finally looked up from the phone and back at her mother, her markings were blazing, the brightest they'd been since the delegation arrived. She said something in Velthari, quick, eager, pointing at the wand, pointing at Dara. Queen Prime replied 3 words, quiet. The translation confirmed later, I see. Her nums, not I see it, not I see. The object, the specific Velthari construction for I see her, a phrase that in their language carries the connotation of recognition, not just visual acknowledgement, recognition of personhood, of presence, of someone worthy of being truly seen. Nums. The ceremony resumed shortly after. It was slower this time, more relaxed. The Queen Prime's demeanor had shifted in a way that the linguists and cultural analysts would spend months trying to fully characterize, but the simplest description was this: she seemed less like a monarch receiving foreign dignitaries and more like a person having a conversation, and the conversation went well, better than well. The agreements that had been stalled for 2 months, trade access, communication protocols, the terms of a preliminary alliance framework, moved. Not dramatically, not all at once, but they moved. Things that had been stuck became unstuck. The Queen Prime made 2 concessions that nobody had expected her to make, and she made them without prompting, in a tone that Ambassador Halst later described as simply direct, as if she decided something before they'd even finished asking. After the formal ceremony concluded, as the delegation was preparing to depart, something happened that was not in any protocol document. The Queen Prime walked to Dara. This was extraordinary. The Queen Prime did not approach people. People approached the Queen Prime. That was simply how it worked. It was not even a matter of formality. It was physics in a way. She occupied a different gravitational center than everyone else in every room she was in. And things moved toward her, not the other way around. She walked to Dara, and she stood before her in a silence that had actual weight to it, and Dara, to her credit, or perhaps simply because she had already exceeded her lifetime quota of appropriate reactions that day, did not step back. And GT, laughter. And GT. The Queen Prime looked at her for a long moment, then she spoke 4 words. The translation, confirmed later, was, "You saw my daughter." Not thank you. The Velthari had a word for thank you. They used it regularly. She did not use it here. What she used was something older, something more specific. The construction she used was the same, one reserved for moments of profound reciprocal acknowledgement, the phrase used between allies who have each, in some essential way, recognized the other's full humanity, or in this case, the full personhood, the full presence. You saw my daughter, you saw her, and you went to her, and you chose that over the ceremony, and I was watching, and I saw you do it. Dara, who had spent the past 4 hours operating entirely on instinct and adrenaline and the faint ghost of a child's laughter, said the only thing she could think of. She was crying alone. I couldn't just stand there. Her translation matrix processed this, delivered it. The Queen Prime was still for a moment, and then slowly, and this was documented, this is in the record, there is footage of this moment, the bioluminescent markings Along her temples brightened just, slightly just once, the Valthari, equivalent of a nod. She said something else then to Dara directly and walked away before the translator caught up. What it caught slightly delayed was this: a species that cannot stand still in front of a crying child is worth standing beside. Ambassador Halst fainted slightly. He was fine. The thing is, and this is the part that gets lost sometimes in the retelling when the story gets turned into documentaries and diplomatic case studies and at least 2 separate novels I'm aware of. The thing is that the Velthari already knew. They knew what humans were like. They'd spent 6 years watching us. They had orbital surveillance. They had cultural analysis teams. They had studied our art and our music and our history and our wars. They had access to every broadcast signal we'd ever sent into space. They knew more about us than we knew about ourselves in certain respects, but knowing about something and seeing it are different things. The Queen Prime had read 1,000 analyses of human empathy. She had reviewed files on human altruism, human social behavior, the particular way humans respond to vulnerability in others. She knew intellectually that humans had this quality, and then she watched a soldier in formal dress uniform set down every consideration except the crying child front of her, and she saw it. That's the difference. That's always the difference. The Velthari Human Accord was signed 14 months later. It is to this day the most comprehensive alliance framework in human history with any non-human civilization. Trade routes shared, research protocols, a mutual defense clause that has been described by 3 separate political scientists as the most carefully worded document ever produced by committee. It is extraordinarily good. Velhari Sa was there for the signing ceremony. She was older now slightly. Her formal armor fit her better. Someone had apparently had it adjusted. She sat in her smaller throne with the particular dignity of a child who has learned that formal occasions can sometimes contain surprises, and watched the proceedings with bright, alert eyes. Daravas was also there for the signing ceremony. She was no longer security detail. The promotion had been fast and slightly bewildering and had come with a lot of new responsibilities she was still adjusting to. She was standing considerably closer to the front this time. She still had the bubble wand. She'd kept it. It seemed wrong to throw it away. It lived in the right pocket of whatever she was wearing always, a small plastic thing that had traveled across light years and changed the course of 2 civilizations and been chewed on slightly by a laughing alien princess who'd gotten a little too enthusiastic with the dipping end during the signing ceremony. At the moment when the final seals were applied to the accord, Velhari Sacha caught Dara's eye across the room. The princess was taller now, but her eyes were the same, large and opalescent, and absolutely full of something that read across all species lines as pure mischief. She mimed blowing. Dara laughed, reached into her pocket. The Queen Prime, from her position at the head of the table, noticed this exchange. Her markings brightened. Briefly, she did not look away. She watched her daughter grinning at the human woman, and she watched the human woman reach into her pocket, and she watched what came next. One bubble, iridescent, rising slow in the still air. The Queen Prime watched it until it popped, and then, for the first time in any recorded interaction with a foreign Delegation, the queen prime of the Velthari Empire, smiled. The xenobiologists lost their minds. Ambassador Halst cried a little, which he later blamed on allergies, which nobody believed, and a small soap bubble made by a child's plastic wand from a gift shop in Portland, Oregon, dissolved into the recycled air of the most important room in the Velthari Empire and left nothing behind except the memory of light. There's a version of First Contact that lives in movies and military briefings, and the collective anxiety of every civilization that's ever pointed a radio dish at the sky. It's tense, it's strategic, it involves weapons or the credible threat of weapons, and very serious people in very serious rooms, making very serious decisions, and maybe that's how it goes sometimes. Maybe for some species that's the whole story, but here's what Derovos proved: not on purpose, not through training, not because she was briefed to do it. She proved that across all the light years, across all the centuries of separate evolution, across all the impossible differences in biology and language and culture and history, there is one thing that travels: the sight of someone choosing a crying child over their own comfort, the willingness to cross a room, the choice to make one small, shimmering, useless, perfect bubble and send it drifting through the dark towards someone who needed it. That travels. If you found this story worth your time, there's another one waiting. The second meeting with the Velthari, when everything almost fell apart because of a misunderstanding about food and how it was Velthari saw, now a teenager who fixed it. Same pocket, different story. See you there.